The silence hit first, sharp, unexpected, almost unsettling, the kind that makes people stop mid-breath because they know something significant is unfolding right in front of them. Then came the reaction. Not polite applause, not routine approval, but a moment that carried weight, the sort that lingers long after cameras move on. In a week where expectations were low and skepticism high, the British monarchy didn't just show up, it shifted the entire tone of the conversation. Standing before one of the most divided political rooms in the world, the king managed what few can. He held attention, commanded respect, and, for a brief moment, brought opposing sides to their feet together. It wasn't flawless, and it wasn't meant to be. There were risks in what was said, particularly around issues that some believed should remain untouched in such settings. But what stood out wasn't caution, it was conviction. And later, at the White House dinner, that conviction gave way to something even more effective. Charm, timing, and a sharp sense of humor that turned formality into something far more human. The room relaxed. The laughter came naturally, and even the most unpredictable exchanges were handled with a lightness that made it all look effortless. At the very same time, thousands of miles away, a quiet image was released. No spectacle, no grand announcement, just a family marking 15 years together. It didn't try to impress, and that's precisely why it did. There was ease in it, something unpolished and genuine, the kind of authenticity that cannot be staged. And then, cutting through all of it, came a familiar echo, claims of distance, of not watching, of having moved on entirely. But saying nothing would have been far more convincing, because announcing indifference rarely comes from a place that truly feels it. As the week unfolded, what became increasingly clear was not just the success of individual moments, but the consistency behind them. There was no sense of scrambling, no visible strain, even under circumstances that would test anyone. The king moved through engagements with a steadiness that spoke of preparation, of someone who understood both the responsibility and the timing of every appearance. Despite ongoing personal challenges, there was no attempt to draw attention to them. Duty remained front and center, and people noticed. The tone of coverage shifted, not dramatically, but enough to reflect something that had been missing for some time, a degree of genuine respect. Alongside that, the family image continued to resonate in a way that felt almost disproportionate to its simplicity. Children at ease, a couple relaxed, even the small, almost overlooked details added to the sense that this wasn't constructed for effect. It felt lived in, familiar, real, and that's where the difference quietly reveals itself. When something is shared without an obvious agenda, it invites warmth. When it appears tied to timing, branding, or calculation, it invites questions. The public may not analyze every detail, but instinctively, they know the difference. One feels like a glimpse, the other feels like a message. And over time, those feelings shape perception far more than any carefully planned narrative ever could. By the time the week drew to a close, the contrast no longer needed explaining. It was simply there, visible in everything that had unfolded. On one side, a steady display of presence, where actions carried the story without the need for reinforcement. On the other, a series of statements attempting to define distance, yet arriving at a moment when attention had already settled elsewhere. It created an imbalance that no amount of explanation could quite fix. Because relevance isn't declared, it's demonstrated. And throughout those days, it was demonstrated quietly, consistently, without forcing the point. There were no dramatic responses, no efforts to counter every claim or control every headline. Instead, there was a calm continuation of what has always mattered most, showing up, doing the work, and letting time do the rest. In the end, that is what lingers. Not the insistence of being unaffected, but the evidence of being present. Not the noise, but the substance behind it. A week that didn't just pass, it settled something. And whether acknowledged or not, moments like that have a way of speaking for themselves long after everything else fades. What made the moment linger wasn't just the speeches or the headlines that followed, but the quiet discipline behind it all, the sense that nothing was being forced, nothing rushed, nothing exaggerated for effect. There was a steadiness to the way events unfolded, almost as if each step had been measured long before anyone else realized its importance. The king did not appear as someone chasing approval or trying to silence critics. Instead, he carried himself with the ease of a man who understands that time, not noise, shapes perception. Even under the weight of personal health concerns, there was no visible hesitation, no sign that the schedule had been softened or scaled back. Long hours, formal settings, constant scrutiny, it all continued without complaint, without spectacle. That kind of consistency does not shout for attention, yet it draws it all the same. People notice when effort is sustained quietly, especially in an age where everything else feels immediate and performative. And that contrast became even sharper when placed alongside the image released during the same week. A photograph that, on the surface, seemed almost too simple to matter, yet managed to capture something far more powerful than any stage moment ever could. It wasn't just the setting or the composition. It was the absence of tension within it. The children weren't posed in a way that demanded admiration, nor did they appear overly aware of the camera. They looked comfortable, familiar with the presence around them, as though the moment would have existed whether it had been captured or not. That sense of ease is difficult to replicate because it cannot be instructed. It comes from routine, from trust, from an environment where appearances are not constantly being managed. Even the smallest details contributed to that impression. The natural spacing, the informal posture, the quiet inclusion of everyday elements that people recognize from their own lives. It didn't attempt to tell a story, it simply showed one. And because of that, it landed with a kind of authenticity that no carefully timed release can manufacture. When people looked at it, they didn't feel like they were being presented with something. They felt like they were being allowed to see something. That distinction matters more than it seems, because it changes the way a moment is received. It becomes less about observation and more about connection. At the same time, the broader response reflected a shift that had been building throughout the week. Coverage that might once have leaned heavily into criticism softened, if only slightly, acknowledging a level of composure that could not easily be dismissed. It wasn't about sudden admiration or dramatic change, but about a gradual recognition that something steady was taking place beneath the surface. Even those inclined to question certain decisions found it harder to ignore the overall effect. There was no single defining moment that explained it all. Rather, it was the accumulation of smaller, consistent actions that created a larger impression. And that is often where lasting perception is shaped, not in isolated events, but in the quiet repetition of them. In contrast, attempts to control narrative from a distance felt increasingly strained, not because they were louder, but because they arrive at a time when attention was already anchored elsewhere. Statements insisting on distance or detachment rarely carry weight when they are delivered in the middle of something they claim to be separate from. It creates an unintended tension, one that people pick up on instinctively. When someone truly moves on, they tend to do so without commentary, without needing to define it repeatedly. And so, when those statements appeared, they did not land as intended. Instead of reinforcing independence, they raised questions about why the need to say it existed at all. That is the risk of speaking too often about what no longer matters. It begins to suggest that it still does. Meanwhile, the steady rhythm of events continued uninterrupted, unaffected by the noise surrounding them. There were no visible reactions, no attempt to counter or respond, just a continuation of what had already been set in motion. And that, in itself, sent a message far more effective than any direct reply could have been. Because silence, when paired with consistency, has a way of settling things without needing to argue them. Over time, people begin to trust what they see repeated, not what they are told once. And during that week, what they saw was a sequence of moments handled with care, without urgency, without the sense that anything needed to be proven. It wasn't about reclaiming attention or correcting perception. It was about maintaining a standard that speaks for itself. The speeches, the engagements, the photograph, each part contributed to a broader picture that felt grounded rather than constructed. And once that feeling takes hold, it becomes difficult to replace with anything else. Because authenticity, once recognized, sets its own benchmark. Everything that follows is measured against it, often without people even realizing they are doing so. And that is where the real impact lies, not in the moment itself, but in how it reshapes expectation moving forward. By the time the dust settled, there was nothing left to spin, reshape, or reinterpret. The week had already written its own conclusion, and it did so with a clarity that no statement could undo. What lingered wasn't just a memory of speeches or carefully timed appearances, but the deeper impression of steadiness under pressure, of presence without performance. People had watched closely, not just at what was said, but how it was carried, the tone, the timing, the restraint. And what they saw was something that felt grounded, not reactive. There was no sense of chasing relevance, no urgency to prove a point, no visible effort to compete for attention. Instead, there was a quiet confidence that comes from understanding that real authority doesn't need to announce itself. It shows up, does the work, and leaves the room knowing the impact will speak later. And it did. Because while one narrative unfolded through action, through moments that felt measured and genuine, another attempted to unfold through explanation, through repeated insistence that distance had been achieved, that detachment was complete, that the past no longer held weight. But the problem with that approach is simple. When people are truly free of something, they don't feel the need to remind the world of it. Freedom speaks in silence, not in declarations. And so, when those declarations arrived, they didn't land as strength. They landed as contradiction. The timing alone made that impossible to avoid. Choosing to emphasize absence in the middle of a moment defined by presence only sharpened the comparison. It didn't redirect attention. It reinforced where attention already was. And people noticed, even if they didn't say it outright. Because perception isn't built on isolated claims. It's built on patterns, on what repeats, on what feels consistent over time. Throughout that week, one pattern stood firm. A sequence of actions carried out without disruption, without deviation, without the need for commentary. Speeches delivered with control, interactions handled with care, appearances made without excess. Even the quieter moments, a glance, a pause, a shared laugh, added to the overall picture of something stable, something practiced, something real. And alongside that, a single image managed to capture what words often fail to express: continuity. Not in a grand, symbolic way, but in something far more relatable, a family at ease, a sense of normality within an extraordinary framework, a glimpse of life that didn't feel constructed for approval. It wasn't trying to prove anything, and that's exactly why it did, because authenticity has a way of settling into people's minds without resistance. It doesn't demand belief, it invites it. And once that invitation is accepted, it becomes difficult for anything artificial to replace it. On the other side, the effort to control narrative felt increasingly disconnected from that reality. Not because it lacked volume, but because it lacked alignment with what people were already seeing. There's a limit to how much perception can be shaped once the audience has made up its mind based on lived observation. You can explain, you can clarify, you can even deny, but you cannot easily override a feeling that has already taken root. And that is what made the contrast so striking by the end of it all. One side allowed events to unfold naturally, trusting that consistency would carry the message. The other attempted to define its position repeatedly, as though repetition might solidify it. But repetition without reinforcement only highlights uncertainty. It draws attention to itself in a way that invites scrutiny rather than acceptance. And so, instead of closing the gap, it widened it. Because people tend to gravitate towards what feels stable, what feels certain, what feels unforced. They trust what doesn't appear to be trying too hard. And during that week, the difference between those two approaches became impossible to ignore. There were no dramatic turning points, no singular moment where everything changed, just a gradual, unmistakable shift in how things were being received. Respect doesn't arrive all at once. It builds quietly, often without announcement, until one day it's simply there. And that is exactly what happened. By the end, there was no need for comparison, no need for analysis. The outcome had already settled in people's minds. Because in the end, what defines a moment isn't who speaks the loudest or who insists the most. It's who remains consistent when it matters, who carries responsibility without turning it into spectacle, and who understands that real influence isn't claimed, it's recognized. And as everything else faded, the commentary, the reactions, the attempt to redirect the narrative, what remained was simple, undeniable, and impossible to overlook. Presence will always outweigh performance. Substance will always outlast noise. And those who quietly hold their ground rarely need to remind anyone that they are still standing.